Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode with Richard Lummis. Today, we're going to take up Calvin Coolidge. Richard, you want to intro us into the person we know as Silent Cal?
Yeah, he is a very interesting guy. Certainly his reputation was helped by some of the things he did, such as one of his favorite quotes was, "I've never been hurt by what I did not say." When he was a teenager, both his mother and his younger sister died, which contributed to what was already a rather fatalistic and taciturn temperament. There's the famous apocryphal story about a state dinner party where his female dinner partner said, "I have a bet that I can make you say more than 3 words," and his response was, "You lose." Career was interesting because it was step-by-step rise, and we tend to be cynical about a lot of things these days, but Coolidge's career in many respects is like a Frank Capra movie. In his view, one of his other famous quotes was, "Nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent." And I think that showed up in his steady march from obscurity in rural Vermont to the presidency of the United States. You want to tell us a bit about his early life?
Yes, and you're absolutely correct. His early life shaped his future life as an adult in ways that seem like a straight line, but perhaps I have a few twists and turns. He was born in Vermont. He was hearty Yankee, meaning New England stock. But even though he was from Vermont, I'm kind of close to thinking he's a Puritan. He and his family, or he moved with his family to Western Massachusetts, and at the difference between the cosmopolitanness of Boston and Western Massachusetts cannot be overstated. I have lived and worked in Western Massachusetts, and it is as antithetical and different to Boston is as, Houston is to, you name, rural West Texas. He developed a view of the world based on living in a rural part of a rural state away from the metropolis of Boston. He pursued education at Amherst College, and he had an early interest in law and public speaking. You mentioned the Silent Cal nickname. I think in many ways it was at this point of his life he began to develop this methodical demeanor. And just because you're quiet doesn't mean you're stupid. It may mean you're thinking, and you may be out thinking everyone around you. And I think in many ways Coolidge was very methodical. He worked through things in a methodical way, and that served him later. People saw silence as something else when I think it was his way of working through issues. I'd also note that he was the great-grandson of Revolutionary War figures, so that I'm sure helped. But it's part of sort of a New England, and I say Yankee not as a derisive term, but a Yankee culture that embraced these strategies or embraced the background that he had. His early training as a lawyer, I think, helped give him that methodical approach to doing things. And I really like your analogy to Horatio Alger. And one thing certainly I didn't mention in the Warren G. Harding episode was we're having people who are just regular Americans go into politics. These are not professional politicians, at least not in the early parts of their lives. And in many ways, they're more formed by either becoming a businessman in Warren Harding's case or a practicing lawyer, as in Calvin Coolidge's case. And those are their formative years that form their political views a little bit later on. You want to tell us about his entry into politics?
Yeah, he had joined and worked with the Republican Club of Northampton, and his reward for that was a spot on the city council. Then he was appointed city solicitor in 1900. He was elected county clerk in 1903 and chairman of the local Republican Party in 1904. So here you can see the methodical nature that you've been talking about. It's just step by step. He then lost the race for the seat on the Northampton School Board in 1905. It's the only election he ever lost. In 1907, he was elected to the Massachusetts State Legislature. In 1910, he became mayor of Northampton. 1912, a Massachusetts state senator. And he was Senate president by 1914. He became lieutenant governor of Massachusetts in 1916 and governor in 1918. His career as governor was mostly noted for his handling of the strike by the Boston Police Department in 1919, and he called out the National Guard to break it up, telling AFL leader Samuel Gompers, "There's no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." And that approach basically catapulted him into the national spotlight just in time for the 1920 Republican Convention.
Yes, I've struggled with this because I'm a student of labor history in the United States, and this was a massive strike. It was in one of the most prominent cities in the United States, and it was broken, without a doubt, very decisively. I mean, it destroyed police unions, or the attempts of police to unionize, for many years. And his reasoning is exactly as basic as you said, that there was no right to strike against the public safety. Originally, I thought it was because he feared Bolshevism or some sort of socialist, which labor unions were thought of at the time. And I don't think it even got to that sophistication level, Richard. I think it was just that he didn't believe the police had the right to strike, period. So that catapulted him literally into the public eye. And I think I mentioned this in the Warren Harding podcast, was that he brought a balance to the ticket. And at some point, most in the history of America, it was thought you needed to have balance in your ticket on a geographic basis. So here we have an Easterner and indeed a Northeasterner in the form of Calvin Coolidge joining Warren Harding from the Midland of Ohio. So I think that helped him as well. And that he, in many ways, was not a mirror image, or even a contradiction image. He was very different than Harding, and I think that probably helped him as well.
Let me also jump in a bit with some of his other policies as governor, because I would basically classify him as that oxymoronic class, the small government progressive. He favored cost of living pay increases for public employees. He favored a limited work week for women and children to 48 hours. And he wanted to limit outdoor advertising. And if you think about pictures of the time with the clutter of all the phone lines and signs everywhere, you can see the appeal. But it just struck me that he was a much more nuanced figure than the one that we would normally believe in, and especially the one for breaking the police strike. But I think just that steady rise up the ladder, classic American success story, and it represented the marriage of traditional American values with a humanitarian progressive streak that people just found extremely appealing.
And his progressive streak was not new. He had been pro-women's suffrage. He had been pro-direct election of senators in the first decade of the 20th century, when that was considered a progressive view. Once again, much more nuanced than perhaps I thought as well. He gets to the vice presidency, and then we're going to take up his presidency after the death of Warren Harding. But how do you see Coolidge's rise as a reflection of the desire to return to normalcy, the desire for stability, or are we reading too much into his own personality as embodying those traits?
I think you're right. Again, as with Harding's background from rural Ohio, the background of Coolidge was a very satisfying story to Americans to hear. The small town virtues surviving as he climbed the ladder to become governor. The idea, I think, was that one of the quotes was that it paired Harding's charisma, which is, as we discussed in our Harding episode, not something we normally associate with Harding, but he certainly had it, with steadiness. And that the silent Cal persona, I think, was a big part of that image of steadiness.
Let's move to Coolidge ascending to the presidency. In our prior podcast, we detailed what at the time was thought to be a sudden death of Warren Harding, although I think it may have been something that a lot of other people saw coming on. And I would just parenthetically note, Richard, that once again, the illness or slowness of an American president, we've had that before. And for people to say, everyone was shocked that we had a 80-year-old president who was a little slower than he'd been before. We've had that before with Warren Harding, although that may have been due to illness. Nevertheless, Harding dies in July of 2023. And then we have one of the most unique situations in American history, which was Calvin Coolidge was sworn in to be the President of the United States by his father at his father's home because he was visiting his father at the time. His father was a local government official in a town in Vermont.
The Justice of the Peace.
Justice of the Peace. And frankly, Richard, I find that to be as an apocryphal story about America as you can have. Your father, who's the Justice of the Peace, swears you in to be President of the United States. I think we've all seen at least the pictures of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in by a U.S. judge. We typically will see a swearing in an inauguration, but there was actually some concern about the swearing in, and so there was later a second swearing in by a sitting U.S. judge just to make sure there were no questions around this. And it almost seemed there must have been some knowledge about the scandals because Coolidge moved pretty quickly to distance himself from the scandals of the Harding presidency. And he did this in a way without firing the cabinet members, which once again seems to be a little counterintuitive. Nevertheless, because he was different than Harding, because his demeanor was so taciturn, he was able to distance himself and show that whatever may have happened, he was not a part of it. And I think that gave him some goodwill from the American people.
I think that's true. And he was aided, of course, by the trivialness of the nature of the vice presidency under the American constitutional system, and that he had very little active role in the Harding administration. He did attend cabinet meetings, but that was about it. He didn't have any portfolio as boarders are or anything like that. He was just basically a placekeeper in case he was needed. And so when he was needed, some of what had happened before didn't necessarily reflect on him. He also benefited, I think, from inheriting a strong economy and peace in Europe. And people were just sort of generally inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt. And also, I think his homespun image, recalling the idyllic American past, continued to be to his benefit at this point.
He stands for election, not re-election, but election in 1924. He is successful in his attempt to be elected himself, and he begins government. The story you told us may or may not be apocryphal, but I think it's pretty clear that his motto was, the business of America is business. What did you see in his pro-business stance, or how did you see his pro-business stance at that time and at that place of American history? Was it warranted then?
I think so. The 19th century had been a time of repeated panics and crises economically. And so I think the main concern here was to preserve and sustain economic prosperity, which meant to him a light hand in government regulation of business and a balanced budget, and cut the national debt, all of which he did. Certainly his personality, he favored restraint over bold action anyway. And he also, as with Harding, although with better results, he favored a hands-off leadership style of delegating matters to his cabinet, with most issues to be resolved at the state level rather than trying to do it all himself. I do want to point out about the silent Cal thing that during his 67 months as president, he held 520 press conferences and spoke on the radio at least monthly. So I think some of what we think we know was more a carefully crafted image than the actual truth.
And I'd like to bring up the one point that really struck me about whether Coolidge was sort of anti-child labor or anti-wage and hour, with the following observation: that as the governor of Massachusetts, he supported wage and hour legislation. He opposed child labor. He imposed economic controls in Massachusetts during World War I. He favored health and safety measures in factories and even worker representation on corporate boards. But he did not support those as president because he believed those were state issues. And so a real federalization of issues that states should handle on a state-by-state basis. And this is part of the sort of reassessment that I thought about when studying for this podcast. He may not have been, my father would call them, a regressive. He just believed that there was a federal level at what federal government should do and the state government should do. He did, however, oppose farm subsidies. And this was the start of an issue which hurt, or was at least part of the political discussion up to and certainly a big part of the New Deal discussion and literally up to today. But he did not believe that the U.S. government should support agricultural prices by purchasing goods and selling them abroad. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was all part of the inequality of and the growth in inequality in the economy, something we've never heard of before. The centerpiece of his economic policy was really tax cutting with the Revenue Acts of 1924 and 26 on Andrew Mellon's advice, which sharply reduced income taxes and especially the surtaxes on wealthy people. The result was robust growth, rising industrial wages, declining unemployment, and a bull stock market. It did fuel speculation, and especially with unregulated margin trading. But what was going on in the farm economy was something a little bit different. The farmers were basically too efficient. They were producing too much, and the demand was not there for it. So prices were low, and so there was increasing debt. And that's why there was so much support for price support. And while I can see Coolidge's principled argument, he also offered no alternatives for how to get out of this cycle. I guess the New Deal brought in some of the land banks and things like that. But Coolidge either lacked the originality to think of those things or just thought it was completely outside of his purview as president.
He had some interesting foreign policy, I don't want to say conundrums, but he firmly, at least seemed to me, to believe in isolationism and non-interventionalist foreign policy. Yet he supported a permanent court of international justice, which became the World Court. And during his tenure as president, we had perhaps the most landmark peace agreement ever, which turned out to be a scrap of paper, but it was the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And I probably shouldn't have said that, but that's what I was taught in junior high school, that the Kellogg-Briand Pact was nothing more than a scrap of paper. But I think at that time it was seen as a real step forward in U.S. International relations. Now, of course, that was obviated by the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany, but there were some international efforts that he was part of, including the recognition of Mexican governments for the first time since the Mexican Revolution. And although we saw the continued occupation of Nicaragua and Haiti and Dominican Republic, you mentioned the pulling out of Cuba. The Coolidge did order the Marines to be pulled out of Nicaragua as well. And maybe we need to do a whole podcast on Latin America and the U.S. steps or missteps there. But so I think there were some limited foreign affairs wins. And I'd just like to reiterate what you said, Richard, was in many ways by keeping that dream team cabinet in place, he was able to bring a continuity to his presidency that I think most people really wanted at that point in time.
Yeah, and he, towards the end of his term, he did show some flexibility, particularly with respect to the 1927 Mississippi flooding, when he allowed Hoover to go and try and organize the relief efforts. He didn't favor direct federal payments, but he sort of skated it, and the federal government did end up accepting some of the burden, the financial burden of recovery from those floods. And against him, you would have to hold his what could be called tepid condemnation of the Ku Klux Klan when they marched through Washington, his support of the Immigration Act of 1924, immigration as an issue in American politics.
Something new.
But it featured quotas on Southern and Eastern Europeans and completely excluded Japanese immigration. Certainly by modern lights, it was racially insensitive at best. Yeah, I also want to jump back a bit to his Silent Cal persona, because he didn't just do press conferences and radio, but he would clown around a lot in pictures and wearing cowboy outfits and Indian headdresses and so forth. And just the playfulness seems to me to be totally at odds with the Silent Cal image. But I guess the way he decided not to run for president by handing handwritten strips of paper to reporters saying, "I do not choose to run for president" in 1928 certainly helped promote the legend of Silent Cal.
I guess the other thing I'd just like to reiterate that we've touched on several times is the interpretation of history. And our interpretation here 100 years later, the interpretations that perhaps I learned as a high school student in the 1970s, 50 years after Coolidge's presidency, and what he was thought of at the time. And I think at the time, he may not have been as popular as Harding had been during the height of Harding's presidency, but he was well thought of. And his taciturness, his silentness, I think was viewed as a positive. And now it's viewed as either burying your head in the sand or choosing to look away, whatever it may be. And I think I choose not to run might be the culmination of that. But I think a lot more nuance is called for, and I hope our listeners will consider the times of the presidents we've discussed and what our views 100 years later or 50 years later may not have been the views at the time in question.
Yeah, and we think we live in an era of unparalleled change. But I think if you look at the amount of technological and economic changes that were going on at the time, certainly it would take a person with a very large ego to think that these were forces that were within one person's understanding or ability to control.
I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode, Richard, where we're going to take up Herbert Hoover.
Ooh, another maligned one. Talk to you next, or wait till next time.